our person and giving out time for a conversation. But I'm sure because it is so close to all of our hearts, we agree to do that even on a weekend. So I would quickly just mention that NIUA is a think tank under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, Government of India. And we have been sort of fortunate to be the technical secretariat for the U20 engagement group under the G20 host that the country is playing this year for the event. U20 is the Urban 20, which is the engagement group of cities of the global 20 countries. And the idea is to bring together issues that are pertinent to the cities amongst these G20 countries, to take the issues which are bothering these cities, to take them forward to at a global forum. And interestingly, the 6 priority areas that were framed for the G20 and the U20 things, out of those, the championing local identity is one of the priority area. And the intention is primarily 2. One, that because all of us know and realize that the local identities, etc., can benefit long-term resilience, particularly in situations of pandemic, in situations of global meltdowns. Probably the local economies are the things that that help the countries stay stable and move ahead. Also, the local knowledge that we have brings together a lot of sustainable solutions to the challenges and all that are there. So it's important to foster the local innovations, the local knowledge, and particularly the country is supporting the Vocal for Local initiative, wherein we want the country to reduce dependence on imports and give more impetus to the local economies, local manufacturing, and the local traditional know-how that we have. So with this, I would quickly introduce the 4 panelists that we have. We are very fortunate to have Laila ma'am with us. Laila Tyabji ma'am is a social activist and a designer, writer, crafter, and I can keep talking and putting that to her. Also, she's been honored with a lot of awards and recognitions, primary of them being for the forum that she's an Indian Civilian Award. She's a recipient of Indian Civilian Award, which is the Padma Shri in the 2012, honored by the Government of India. In addition, there are other things which I will hold for the moment due to the paucity of time. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. We also have Gurmeet Rai, ma'am. She is a urban conservationist and conservation architect based out of Delhi. And there are so many projects that we have loved that she has worked on, and across the country, abroad, etc. A lot of World Heritage sites that she's been associated with and given her expertise and knowledge for that. We have with us then Professor Bertacchini, who is an associate professor of economics with the University of Torino, Italy, and with an interesting combination that he's an economist with a deep-rooted interest in heritage and culture, and therefore we call you a cultural economist more than anything else. I kept Jagan Shah at the last because he's more sort of a team from NIUA. We've been fortunate to have you as the director. NIUA, in fact, most of us who are here joined NIUA when he was the director. So welcome aboard. He's a senior consultant with the World Bank and a senior fellow at Arthur Global today. And he's also been a senior infrastructure advisor with the UK government during 2019-21. So with this, I pause this and quickly start taking up the questions. We already have some people putting up their hands. I think, Tarni, you should be the one managing that part, all right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
If there is anything that that has to come between the conversation on the forum, we take it up. Otherwise, we hold them for the later part of the conversation, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So with this, what I would want to do is probably start with the first question with Professor Bertacchini, because that the one which is listed there states with what constitutes of local identity. And while most of us here might have similar orientations, we would want to hear this particularly from you with your sort of, and how does Italy or how does your area of work in that side of the world treat the definition of local identity? We would just request you to talk on that. And considering the time is very short, we'd want you to keep it brief, but of course we would
Yes.
want to keep hearing it. That's the other part of the story. Please, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the question. And yes, local identity, it's a very strange economic resources for economists, because it's something intangible, but that today is becoming more and more relevant as a competitive resources for places and regions. Let me just remember that a few years ago, there was a publication, a report sponsored by the World Bank that was called The Economics of Uniqueness. And that report actually was addressing the same issue. Can be a local identity that is a very vague concept, constitute a real added value for local development? And definitely, I would say yes, local identity, it's important as a strong linkage with local development. In cultural economics, we actually study this linkage. And let me say very shortly, there are two concepts that we use in understanding the link between culture and economic development, that are the cultural capital. Cultural capital has been a concept developed actually to think about culture, cultural heritage, tangible and intangible heritage as a productive asset, not only as an asset that has to be conserved, that provides also dilemmas for conservation because we need money, but can be used for productive purpose. And this change of vision, it's actually something that is very important from an economic viewpoint. And the second concept that we use, and in Italy we have also, and in Europe we also pioneered this concept, is that of cultural district, applying the logic of industrial district, of productive clusters that we know there are many different economic activities that tend to cluster in district, but applying this logic and this vision to clusters of cultural activities, of crafts. Just to give you an example, the logic of cultural districts came out in Italy looking at crafts production. The idea was that crafts, material cultural production is an economic activity that embeds strong cultural values, and the key economic challenge is actually to make these activities cooperate and work together and follow a district logic that enhance their value and the local and traditional identity.
Thank you for those words. I completely understand that it is important to organize it to be able to handle it better, and therefore the cultural capital and the cultural districts help us to put them in some sort of a bracket wherein we can take some initiatives for it. So with this, I would, because we already spoke about the crafts and the cultural values, I would take the next question with Laila Madam, because we know that you so closely work with the craftsmen of India, and you're doing things that can, you know, give them that kind of recognition and the required support, etc. So what kind of challenges do you think that the Indian craftspeople are facing in terms of competing, particularly with the modern manufacturing and because all of us know that the machine made stuff is more easy to generate, quicker to generate, the bulk is easy to manage. So what sort of challenges do you think the traditional craftspeople are facing?
Well, I think I would, if I'm talking about the challenges of craftspeople today, I would require your whole session, but I'll try and kind of summarize it. And I think the crux really lies in that sentence of the previous speaker, where he talked about local identity. And local identity, particularly in a country as diverse and multifaceted as India, is not national identity. And I think that if we look at that, and particularly in the context of crafts, and we look at that as a huge advantage rather than a disadvantage, that we still have in India, literally, I think 200 million was the latest count of craftspeople. And all these craftspeople are not a homogeneous lump. all making the same thing. Each region of India, each district, almost every village has a distinctive craft identity of its own. It may be a weave, it may be a pot. In fact, there are potters all over India, but each sort of region of India has a very distinctive shape of the kind of pot, even a normal water pot, which is a very everyday item. So I think that we have to play on that diversity. And that diversity is something that no industrial process can possibly imitate. And if we stick to that, instead of going about, as many people working in the craft sector and many of the planners and economists have done, where we've lumped all India's craftspeople into one kind of thing and say, we have so many millions, so they all should be able to produce, uniform products at a low price, and try and grab the export market by talking about numbers and lower costs. That is not going to get us anywhere, because then you can just put a machine and they can churn out these things. If we look at the fact that every craftsperson in this country has a unique sort of design methodology in their hands and their head, and get them to produce these unique products, and to realize that, for instance, in handloom, you can change the color and the motif every 5 or 6 meters without increasing the cost. While if you're talking about an industrial weaving mill process, you'd require at least 1,000 meters to make a change of color or motif cost effective. And we should look at that. We always look at our craftspeople as something rather primitive, downtrodden, which we have to kind of support and sustain, instead of looking at them literally as a gold mine of skills, professional skills, which no other country has in the world. And even if you look in the context of Delhi, for instance, every corner of Delhi actually still has, in spite of the size of Delhi and the fact that it's a metropolis and everything, that we still have living craftspeople. And we should be using these as an asset, not just as, say, tourist attractions, though that is certainly one thing that we can feature, but also as people who can decorate and create things in our government buildings, in our public spaces and all, which make Delhi have a very unique identity.
Yeah, very befitting points, ma'am. I agree that we should look at them as gold mines rather than keeping them as the receiving end and sort of primitive and interesting. With this, I take the next question with Gurmeet, ma'am, because the craftspeople and the local traditional know-how is one part of the story. But there are other sectors with which the creative economy conversation intersects, particularly with tourism, with urban planning. Like ma'am said, the tourism is of course one part of it, but there are the sustenance of it as economic model, etc. So how do you think that, what would be your, your thoughts on how does this creative economy segment intersect widely with tourism, with urban planning, with social innovations, and you being somebody who is very, very closely associated with built heritage, how do you think that, all of this to be brought together will make sense for this conversation?
Thank you very much for that question, Ruchi. Actually, practicing as an urban conservation specialist or somebody who's engaged with the sector in India is actually a very, very blessed position to be in, because I think all the answers that, all the questions that you're asking, the answer really comes from the people, from within the urban setting where we actually engage. Now, over the years, my experience has been that the most critical part of our looking at even, local identity here, first of all, like you asked the question that how is that defined? Now, for me, local identity really, that, like Laila says, is the crux of the whole narrative, that it definitely gets defined geographically. Local really can be defined. It could be a neighborhood, it could be a city. Now, that one kind of engages, it's clearly not large geographical areas, whether it's a state or the country is concerned. The other thing is that knowing the other is, I think, to my mind, the most critical bit when we kind of go into an urban setting to engage at the urban planning level and to understand the local cultural knowledge system. The entire creative expression of urban planning, at least in the sector, the way I function, I work in urban conservation, is from this phrase of knowing the other. And, I would demonstrate it. And it's not just about, it's not a noun and it's not an adjective. It's actually a verb also. So even to know the other, the processes that we engage with, to be able to know the other becomes a very, very important part. And the cultural expression is not just visual. It's not just the activity. It actually then is all the human senses, or you actually get to understand the other by engaging with all the 5 senses that human beings are blessed with here. And I would like to demonstrate this from the perspective that, like, for instance, I was working in the city of Puri. And in Puri, you've got, the whole idea was, okay, we're going to improve, do something for the natural heritage. And we realized that the holders of this natural heritage were these people who live in jagaghars. I mean, their jagaghars are small cultural institutions, and they all have water bodies. And we realized the answer of addressing Puri's sweet water challenge, the depletion of sweet water, lied with revitalization of the ponds in these jagaghars. Now, how do you do that? And the only way to do that is to understand the living traditions. How do people who inhabit or who work and who are actually the custodians of these jagaghars, what are the processes that are important to them to be able to then revitalize these water bodies? So what I'm really trying to say is that mapping, understanding the local identity by way of the tangible and intangible, deciphering the local knowledge embedded in the feature and the processes and the knowledge system that the people carry, the inhabitants of that place carry, is where we get our solutions for the most modern challenges. Today, everybody is talking about climate action and so on. And I think many of our solutions are embedded in trying to decipher what the traditional knowledge system holds.
That's very, very pertinently and very nicely put, ma'am, because like I mentioned in the beginning, the 2 primary reasons for picking up this topic as the priority area was that the local economy gives you that route to sustenance, particularly in global meltdown situations and pandemics, etc. And the second one was that they really have those solutions. They have lived those solutions for ages to be, and very, very probably said that they are the solutions to the modern day challenges. I mean, with time, things are deteriorating, and the traditional know-how is something that is very, very pertinent to continue and to foster and to not let it be lost in the whole system of urbanization. So with this, I want to take the next question to Jagan Shah. And although I want to speak to you about how cities, I mean, that was the first question, but in the context that when people are central to the local identity, how does one mainstream community participation? Because all of this conversation requires a lot of people's narrative, bringing in people together. So I would take that one with you first, and then see how I put in the first question later.
Sure, thanks, Ruchi, for that question. I think mobilizing community participation or getting people to come together to recognize identity, it's become more complex because of two phenomena which are both related in some sense to migration. One is urbanization and people migrating into metropolitan centers, which is the mega trend in India. And the second is the diaspora. people traveling far away from their original place of location, either within the country or abroad. And very often they carry their identities with them. And sometimes, as we are seeing in the Indian diaspora, they champion their identity probably a lot more than their own sort of country cousins back home. And that creates a very peculiar thing in terms of a market. It creates what I see is a market for kitsch, kitsch being sort of almost the enemy of the authentic. But that's what the metropolitan economy is about. It's about consumption, and you consume identity. So I think that complicates matters a little bit. And it's interesting that Enrico talked, I think, a little bit about the authenticity that one finds, especially in Europe, and why Europe is the destination of choice if you're a cultural tourist, especially, is also because the regimes of geographical indicators, the understanding of authenticity has evolved to a far greater extent, also because of intellectual traditions that documented and created histories of the crafts and how the crafts contribute to modern art and architecture and everything. So there's a very rich amount of work that went into establishing what is authentic and ascribing value to what is authentic. India, however, is urbanizing, growing, and extremely dynamic as a cultural space. And in that space, consumerism tilts the balance very much towards the consumption of kitsch rather than the appreciation of authenticity, because authenticity, unfortunately, and Laila knows this far better than any of us, I imagine, has unfortunately also gotten associated with poverty because of the decline of the crafts in the larger economy through the colonial period and into modern India. So I'd like to just make that sort of the key point in my first intervention, which is that this gets a lot more complicated given the growth trends that India represents, not just within India, but also globally. And love to discuss more about this. Thanks.
So in fact, sir, taking another question with you forward, because this is one part of the challenge that there is a lot of the appreciation of authenticity, etc., is really a challenge, particularly in the kind of urban scenarios we are all living in, and with the kind of maybe with the kind of costing, etc., it comes with, because you find things cheaper, you really don't know what is the true thing, what is more authentic than anything. And therefore, in that context, because a lot of this, the local identities and the crafts, etc., a lot of it is informally organized. I mean, they are not into the main formal system of economic assessments. And so how is there a need, first of all, to formalize these? We understand it as planners and urban specialists that probably once you formalize it, it is easier to manage and all. But do we really need to formalize it? Because with formalization, of course, I think it will lose its sense. And I don't know. I mean, this is my thought.
I think that's a fascinating question, Richi, pretty much getting us closer and closer to the heart of this problem. So it is informal in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of a very, very formalized and very organized state. But it isn't informal on ground. If you look at the folk musicians of Rajasthan, they're not informally organized. They're very formally organized, in fact, maybe not on terms that the state recognizes. So I think formality and informality are not, to my mind, the key issue here. The issue is what constitutes formality, right? And are those the terms on which the modern state is willing to talk to artists, performing artists, cultural workers, anybody with tacit knowledge? Does it even respect its historians enough for it to even extend to crafts, right? I mean, so a society that respects historians will respect the crafts, I think. Those two are aligned to each other. So I think the formal informal is, to me, a moot point, because simply for the purpose of survival, artists formalize their relationships with each other. They unite around their own particular tacit knowledge. However, the state doesn't necessarily recognize them like that, right? So again, recognizing the formality of a group, which sometimes might be a clan or even sometimes it's a caste, sometimes it's a family, to recognize that under the ambit of the state requires a lot of nuance, and our cultural policies don't allow for it. So, because it requires one thing which the state hates, which is discretion, right? It requires some application of mind. It requires people to, bring together the best minds in the country to deliberate on something. These are processes with which we have become more and more frustrated and have lost any faith in them. But arts, crafts, and cultures cannot survive without them. So we've got a fundamental problem here. I'll just pause there. Thanks.
Yep.
Very, very valid point. I guess that we have been struggling with this formality and informality question since the day we were planning to put together that white paper also. And I have team members here who would agree. But I think now it is time that we start thinking a little different, because what you said is right, that they might not be formal in the overall senses, but they are quite formal in their own context and own setting.
So I think there's a very good study that sociologists and even urban planners should be doing, which is to look at clusters that have been created for craftspeople over the last 50 years. How have they fared as places, right? Because you're talking about formalization. I remember Rajasthan government created, Gurmeet, you know this better, I think, Awas Vikas Sansthan created crafts, villages. And we've created these kinds of clusters for 50 years now. What has happened to them? What has happened to Katputli colony in Delhi, for instance, right? These are the subjects where you understand the nuances about formalization and informality. Thanks.
So with this, I would want to hear Laila madam, because also we had put that question somehow related to this, that what needs to be done better to integrate the creative industries and the traditional crafts with the, to bringing together some focused economic strategies or some sort of not support, but what can the government policies or strategies do to give, because you have been with them, you have seen them, struggle with issues related to sustenance, also with the kind of, because if the practice is not sustained enough, it doesn't move to the next generation. The next generation automatically looks at something else which is more financially viable and suitable and sustainable. So what is your thought on what kind of focus government should think of? And I don't know how much we'll be able to do, but I guess this is one opportunity wherein we can once again try and bring forward this discussion.
Well, I think when you look at this, you need to understand that although diversity is a word that most people nowadays look at with some trepidation and in fact discouragement, it is actually the core of most cultural practices in India, including craft. And you cannot talk of craftspeople. I mean, I've been working in the craft sector for 50 years now, and I have not found a single government scheme which actually meets the needs of craftspeople, because each of them structure themselves in a different way. Some are family units, some are cooperatives, some are working under a sort of a middleman or an exporting house or whatever. And for one reason or the other, all these people actually do not fit in the ambit of the scheme. I think when you're working with anybody, you have to listen to the people, you have to listen to the potential beneficiaries before you create your scheme. However, I've been in, I don't know how many scores of committees, task forces, strategies, this, that, and the other for craftspeople. And there's hardly ever a craftsperson there. Or if he is there, he's the sort of tame government pet who's been kind of told that he has to agree with everything. And he does it because he's nervous that he will not get benefits in the future. So I think that we have to listen, and we have to listen not only with our ears, but with our hearts and our heads as well. And we have to look at it in a case-by-case way. This is very difficult, I agree. It's perhaps not even cost-effective, but as result-effective, it certainly is the way to go. Daskar has not taken a government scheme for the, as I think we gave up about 35 years ago, because we found that we were trying to squeeze ourselves into the scheme to the detriment of the end result because we required that funding. We decided that actually we could go it alone. It's been very hard. It has contributed to the fact that my hair is totally white. But as far as results go, I'm happy to say that out of the 750 different crafts organizations and families we work with all over India, all of them, with the exception of perhaps 2, are today sustainable, working from what they generate. And I think that having given up the attempt to force ourselves into government schemes has been quite fruitful. The other thing that I think that I'd like to say is that we have to recognize that solutions that come to us from either abroad or a module that has worked well in some part of India is not necessarily suitable, is not a cap that you can fit everybody into. An example I'd like to say is this huge sort of edifice which has been created in Benares for handloom weavers. Of course, handloom weavers are the pride of Benares. Obviously, you feel that they need to be sustained and invested in. But what is the way that a Banarsi weaver has been selling their products over the centuries? It is a very personalized thing where clients, their expensive products, their saris and fabrics which are geared to family occasions, festivities, weddings, every person wants their own individual thing. And luckily, it's handloom, so it can be crafted to the client's specifications. But if you put, and clients come to their house, they're shown a whole range of designs and products, and then they say, oh, I want this color, but I want the border from this and the pallu from that, and et cetera, et cetera. And every family has their pet craftspeople. Now, if you put them in a 3-story building with little cubicles for them, which looks, yes, it looks like a shopping mall. It looks very 21st century, it should be great. But no Banarsi handloom weaver wants other people to see who is coming into their stall, what is the kind of things they're showing. It's a very personalized way of selling things. There are many crafts in India, including jewelry, including saris, etc., which are done like that. It's just like if you were an architect, you wouldn't put all the architects into a 3-story building and expect people to come and shop around for what looks the best from the outside window. So I think we have to ask the communities what suits them, what works well for them. Is a handloom hub the way that they want to go? Is a community center, facility center? In some places, it works very well, where you have a raw material sort of depot, you have certain types of machinery, you have water refining plants, which they share, and then the other things they conduct in other ways. But in other kind of crafts and professions, it may not work. So listen to what they want. I mean, the cluster scheme is so straitjacketed, it really doesn't benefit. The amount of money that goes into it doesn't result in the kind of thing. Then people say that actually investing in crafts is futile. This is something of the past. It's not the thing of the future. I say that crafts is one area that India is ahead of every other country in the world, and we should be investing in it, but we should invest in it according to what the needs of the craftspeople are, and not what our pet notion of what an ideal structure is.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it still keeps those questions on in our mind, that what would be a sort of final recommendation that, the white paper should be putting forward? Because the more and more we get into this conversation, we realize that it's very complicated in sense, because it's very, very personal to people. I mean, there's no...
Yeah, but there are some common criteria which everyone requires and which can be provided collectively. And there are other things where the craftsperson should be able to get a loan and do with it what he wants, to buy the raw material, to store it, to travel, to do whatever. And that should be up to the discretion. It shouldn't be within certain, stiff guidelines. We say that if he takes X, then he also has to take Y component, and he has to share that with whatever this thing cluster may be. I mean, it doesn't work like that.
So with this, what I will do is hear Professor Enrico of how does that part of the world, Europe, because Europe is also truly blessed with a lot of identity and a lot of traditional owned stuff. So how do we deal with it? Is there some progress made in sort of, supporting this section, or we still are struggling with the same questions that Laila ma'am was mentioning?
Well, I think that, yes, we are somehow still struggling with the same questions. I mean, what Laila was saying is actually what we witness and see in also the policy debate on how to protect or enhance the local identity. And there are no solutions that fit all. Let me just give you an example that that is very similar. I mean, we share a lot of similarities in crafts. The glassmaker, for example, in Murano, which is a quite renowned location for artistic glass production in the Venice Lagoon, and they faced similar problems, for example, in terms of competition from cheaper products, problem of signaling the quality or the branding. And actually, in some years ago, one solution that was proposed, that is commonly proposed both in Europe, but I think also in India, that is collective trademarks, the use of intellectual property protections, collective intellectual property protections, like also geographical indications. In that case, for example, there was a lot of effort in creating a private collective trademarks that was proposed to protect, but also to help the all the crafts, all the glassmakers to organize in an association and starting cooperating to be more productive, more let's say to empower them also in the market. And finally, just to tell you the story short, that collective trademark experience almost failed, because actually in a collective action terms, not all the glassmakers were intended to participate. And this story also tells that within the community of producers, of craft producers, there can be diverging interests or incentives. So the situation is quite complex. Some programs that, for example, support heritage or tangible heritage and crafts do exist and are also quite important in Europe. But let me underline one point: it's also quite complex because the responsibilities for designing policies sometimes in this field are quite overlapping. I mean, local identity, well, all the resources that belongs to the local identity may be responsibility of Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Economy. Nowadays also ministries who have competencies in technology, because of course the technological push also in the transformation of these productions is becoming quite strong. This can be seen quite quite neatly, for example, in the creative, cultural and creative industries debate, where there are many agencies, many departments, many ministries that want to have a say. And depending, I mean, it's not very easy to find, let's say, a cooperation also between these agencies to design programs that can be really effective for those type of sectors like the crafts.
So just taking this a little forward, are there any specific institutional structures that comes to your mind that there are existing ones, or as an expert, do you think that the first does it require an institutional structure to help this organize better? Because I understand from your pointers that in India also the Ministry of Culture is the one which is actually supposed to take care of all of this, because it takes care of the built and the tangible, both kinds of things. Also the performing arts, all of these, the art and the craft, I understand falls under the the ambit of the Ministry of Culture.
Craft is actually under the Ministry of Textiles, which is under the Ministry of what is it? Industries Ministry.
All right, but that I can understand will only be the crafts part, the handloom part. So, I mean, and in fact, I would rather put this question to the forum as and would hear thoughts from all of you. That is there a need? I mean, I'm left with 2-3 main pointers. One is that is there a need for an institutional structure, somebody who at all levels is responsible and is able to understand this segment, because the needs keep changing once you zoom down to the level. The top ministry may probably be the one who arranges for the funds and puts the national level allocations. But going down, of course, the implementation challenges, how do you help the community reap the benefit of the larger scheme? Or how does it, I mean, as a top-down approach, the institutional structure mostly is existing. What we probably are missing is the link of how do you give the benefits to the community directly. So one is that. Second, I think I will, because Gurmeet ma'am is there, I would want to hear about how, in addition to the government stuff that we are talking, the other agencies, the international funding, donating agencies which are related to this segment, how can they support the national level initiative maybe? So the first question, let us first hear how about the institutional structure that we want to put in place, or how can we support that or strengthen it? Maybe Laila ma'am can take it first, and then we hear Jagan Shah's thought.
I also like that.
Yeah. Sure.
So, is it you want me to speak?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I would say let's not create an institution. Let's not add one more layer to a very many layered kind of things, which means that the trickle-down effect to craftspeople becomes very minimal by the time it reaches. But I do think that a very in-depth conversation, inquiry into the craft sector and the interface of the craft sector and the government would be a very good thing. During the run-up to the 8th plan, which was, I think, somewhere in the sort of mid 1980s or the end of 1980s, there was a task force which was set up because there was a very major shift which had been suggested, is that government plan should also be open to NGOs and organizations. And that discussion and the kind of paper that was created on it has been the basis for a lot of craft and government planning. But it is now obviously 40 plus years on, and things have changed drastically, both in the craft sector as well as in the marketplace and the global situation. So I think it would be very useful to do it. It had a catalytic effect at the time, but some of those schemes then got frozen and became terribly static and irrelevant. And I think it's time to have that dialogue again. And I think today craftspeople are much better equipped to add their voices to this discussion. which at that time they were really not. So I would suggest that, but I would certainly say, let's shake up the schemes, let's shake up the ways in which government patronage.
Am I audible? I think I lost.
You are, but Laila, we didn't hear you for the last 5
Yeah.
seconds. We missed that last part.
I think that's
think-
okay. You saw the direction in which I was going.
But still,
I have to
but
say
still,
that
I think you went on
let's
mute by mistake.
let's have a review of the situation. Let craftspeople also add their voices, for which they're much better equipped today. And let's shake up the methodology in which government and the craft sector interact, but let's not create another institution.
Ma'am, my idea to suggest the institution was not really creating one more. The idea is that since we have that Ministry of Culture, there is a culture department at the state also. But what I have seen is that they mostly just organize those events, those big events where there will be some performances, they will sell the tickets, they will make some money. So that is one thing that is very, very visible and as an action that these state level institutions are doing. So, but then not really doing what is required was the idea. And therefore, I think the idea of shaking up the schemes and bringing that dialogue together. And once the dialogue is initiated, of course, it will have to be taken at all levels, and something only at the central level wouldn't be enough. So probably that is the way to look forward.
I think my plea, Ruchi, which is I think the plea of all craftspeople as well as all the individuals and organizations that work with craft, is to say that it is time now in 2023 to look at craftspeople like other occupations and other professionals are looked at.
Yes.
And let's have places where they can access funding, they can access support of different kinds, including HR, etc., but not have them boxed into schemes, but let them apply for these and create their own proposals which suit their own needs and tailor them, and maybe have a help cell in whichever ministry it is or something that can handhold them through this process. Because I can tell you the present schemes are so difficult to fill that even an organization like Daskar, which is English speaking, Delhi centric, finds it really, really, really difficult to push these through and to, explain what it is. And as I said, very often it doesn't fit the purpose. So I think that first, a kind of really a very intensive brainstorming thing, including craftspeople, as well as other players in the sector, and then creating maybe a new way in which craftspeople and crafts organizations can access money and use it. And and leaves the government should not be the implementing agency, whether it is of a craft mela or whether it should be a marketing and export drive, international export drive, that it should be the catalyst and it should be the funder, but people must find the format and forum that suits them.
Right. I guess Gurmeet ma'am also raised her hand. She wants to add to this question. Am I audible? Gurmeet ma'am?
Gurmeet has frozen on the screen.
I think so. Yeah. We'll just call her up. Meanwhile, Jagan sir, would you want to add some thoughts to this?
Sure. I think I'd love to extend Laila's argument. In fact, I think Laila, it's been 20 years, I think, since the creative and cultural industries were talked about. And this was thanks to UNESCO and all the people working in the heritage of crafts and culture. I think, Ruchi, what you do at NIUA is very, very relevant in the sense that cities have to become custodians as well. And one of the ways in which that can happen is by recognizing the crafts within the larger rubric of the cultural and creative industries. The word industries is a very powerful word. It will take you to the root of the problems that we are facing today, because Indian crafts became worldwide famous in 1851 with the Crystal Palace exhibition, which was the exhibition of the industries of all nations. And I think it also gives us an entry point today for reviving our attention on the crafts. I think personally, I feel that all that needs to be known in terms of approaches and theoretical perspectives is known today to the people who work in crafts in this country. What is missing is the ear from the state to the importance of this as an economic force. If you look at, for instance, the socioeconomic caste census, the presence of craftspersons and cultural workers in that census is very convincing evidence of how ubiquitous the cultural worker is in this country, and in our cities as well. And yet there is no recognition that they exist, and that, importantly, and I think Laila's work at Daskar showed this very much, importantly, crafts can be the sustenance for the next generation. That's crucial. In 2010, I devised an arts, crafts, and culture strategy for the Tata Trust, in which we had studied, Laila, the work that you did at Daskar, Andhra, taking the younger generation of weavers, the young girls in the family, and working with NID designers to actually devise new color schemes for what was the traditional palette. I mean, that kind of innovation, and this was done successfully. This is not something that was a flash in the pan. That kind of innovation is very, very well accommodated by crafts communities. You see, crafts communities are not regressive in their attitude to the world. They're very progressive. They're responding to what happens outside. So I think, it's urbanists like ourselves who need to champion the economic significance to cities and to city regions of the crafts. Okay, I think that's really crucial. So whether it is somebody who does, who does Aresh work and lives on the outskirts of Jaipur and can barely find housing, or whether it is a jali maker, or it is somebody who does brass work, which can be part of your household architecture, and yet finds no space at all, can't find a home in the city, right? So recognizing the economic value is fundamental to, I think, the institutional framework as well. We don't need new institutional frameworks, like Laila said. The city government should actually have the bandwidth to recognize that this is economic value. And increasingly in a world that India wants to occupy, which is a world of services, a world of intangible economic values as well, of tacit knowledge. In that world, the crafts can live a much better life. Yeah. But that's provided we are willing to also come together and build the evidence and the compelling arguments.
Absolutely, and so important that craft is not just making a product or a small souvenir, but it can actually be used in every aspect of life, from architecture and interiors to garments to whatever. And we need to be open to that. I really love the idea that, I don't know, is it America or is it, I forget now which country, that has a compulsory thing that every building, public building, has to have 5% of its budget used for the arts and crafts. And I think something like that would be so wonderful here, because you go to meetings discussing craft and you can't see a single evidence of craft. Even the folders in which you get your papers are made of plastic.
Yeah. So I think Ruchi, for instance, just to quickly connect with something that Laila mentioned in Banaras, the new sort of structure that's been created, and there were 50,000 families of weavers, right, and living inside the city, and then you're trying to displace that, whereas you could have created that new center for the next generation of those families and given them a modern art school, just the way that King Charles did with his School of Arts in London. So I think imagination can go a long way in public policy. And this is not an area where you can do without imagination. Thanks.
I so agree with that Banaras example. We recently went there, and I mean, looking at the map of what it was and what it is was something that is so hard to accept as an urban planner and an urbanist, that it just didn't fit in the.
It's ridiculous, Ruchi, because you could have tapped into the cultural heritage tourism value of the actual craftsperson's habitat, and you could have tapped into the next generation producing innovation, and kept everything alive. But anyway, we killed one to make the other.
Yes, very, very evidently. So, Gurmeet ma'am, now I think we have you. Would you want to add that layer of how international organizations, I mean, are they really focused on, are they really intending to support all of this, or is it again the other side of the coin? I don't know.
Ruchi, it's quite interesting that you've asked me this question. About 20 years ago, I was involved in doing one conservation project in Punjab, funded by UNESCO, UNDP, United Nations Volunteers Program, and ASI. And there was, and what was very interesting was it was a project of restoring a mosque, which is the caretakers are the Sikh community. It's quite interesting. It's quite symbolic that, and it's a lot of materials available online on it. It's called Guru Ki Masjid. Now, interestingly, the Nihangs who were looking after the mosque said that you have to run a community kitchen for the workers, because this has to be in the tradition of Seva. Now, what I'm trying to really talk about here is that when Jagan talks about recognizing the craft worker, I would say it's the economic significance of the cultural worker. I think, that's where it resonated with me, because he said, the tractor trolley will come with workers, with community members every day from different villages, and you will run a kitchen, and they will come and do their work because they have to do seva. But you put the diesel in the tractor, and you also run the kitchen, and that's how this work is going to happen. Now, because it was funded by UNESCO, I could run that kitchen. But if it was funded by government, I would not have been able to do it. There would have been, this would not have been acceptable. Similarly, we worked in a temple where, again, funded by the same project, by the United Nations Volunteers Program, where they actually funded the positioning of 2 conservation architects, 2 art conservators, and 2 social workers, while this temple was being restored, and the village requested that their young children should be given, their young people should be given an access to actually earn from the conservation work of the temple, which they have been the caretakers of. And because the United Nations volunteers were being paid by the United Nations Volunteers Program, we had no problem in it was easy to fund their time while they gave the technical expertise in the restoration of the temple. Now, talking about international organizations funding that, neither the United Nations Volunteers Program questioned this particular model. UNESCO, in fact, encouraged that model. But the rest of the projects that we did in the local, talking about local identity, in that local context, where certain expressions of local engagement was harnessed, was encouraged. But when ASI funding came in from Government of India, we had to use the model of the contractor. No community member could be funded or supported in the conservation of subsequent buildings, because the contractors brought in their workers from Bihar, from UP, or wherever. Now, whether it was 20 years ago, of course, we got a UNESCO award for this particular project. And it was, this whole method had many other advantages. One is it actually empowered the people to actually express, ask questions, participate in the decision-making in terms of material. And they accepted traditional material and all of that, though, people don't build with lime anymore and such like, but they understood authenticity. because we understood the processes, authentic processes of conservation, which the community valued. They understood the material aspect of it, which we valued. So it was a dialogue. But my subsequent projects, which have been funded by, where government schemes, and this is not to be overtly critical of government funding, where government provides financial resources for doing the project, the scheme like Laila says or Jagan has been talking about, we need to apply those principles, the local principles, and find solutions anchored in those local principles, while system of monitoring, evaluation, governance, and all of that, basically you don't want monies to be misappropriated and so on, where those kind of indicators can be managed. We need to recognize all the other, aspects of local identity when we come down to cultural heritage conservation. Now, the bottom line is, after 20 years, when I go to these sites, our intervention for a short period of time did not disconnect people from their heritage. But the moment you bring in the contractors and workers and treat the local people as somebody who has to be kept outside the boundary wall while this great conservation work is going on, in that period of conservation project, you actually manage to create fractures, because the project comes under scrutiny by the powerful, and it alienates the local community who actually are the caretakers. So to recognize the continuum, so that when you leave as a professional, the site continues to be with the original custodians, the caretakers, and does not get hijacked by somebody else, is a very important indicator of any sustainable work in cultural heritage sector. And I think it would be relevant in the case of crafts as well, that you bring in the money in such a way and you realize that the craftsmen have become workers, some labor, they are called labor, and somebody else, gets the position of pride, and this is something which is a very, very colonial model, I would imagine. So I think we haven't been able to quite decolonize our models or even our minds to be able to put systems in place which actually empower people who actually are the bearers of this knowledge. And as far as the international practice is concerned, the most interesting work that is happening in UNESCO right now in ICOMOS is their working group on rights-based approaches and heritage management. And in fact, the amount of work that is going in ICOMOS is now also informing the operational guidelines of the World Heritage Convention. So while the convention does not get altered, the operational guidelines every few years gets modified to bring in the new thinking. And these documents are all available, but I think that the challenge would now really be, the need would really be to actually translate that thinking, which whether you understand from the ground up or from top down, from UNESCO and all of that, needs to be factored into our planning instruments and our instruments of governance and our institutions of higher learning in terms of that produce conservation architects and so on, and other people in cultural sector. Yeah.
We totally get that sense, ma'am. I understand that, because having worked in the urban sector, I've had instances where I've been told that we are part of the Ministry of Urban Development, and this is something which the Ministry of Environment and Forests has to take care. So that silo system has to be sort of broken up to be able to deliver a larger good for the community and for more sustained this thing. I have Jagan sir's hand raised, so please add to it.
Just quickly, I thought I also should mention that while one can see this as the role of the state and the craftsperson, so like just two actors in this, there's a very important actor which is between these two, right? And that's your cultural professional. Today, we need to think in terms of curators of art exhibitions. We need to think in terms of arts directors and others who actually help to do the necessary intermediation between the state and this. And and the real resource, the real value. And India is in desperate shortage of that. So if you were to actually responsibly deal with, in a positive way, deal with the value of arts and crafts in our cities, in our country, we will need to produce that large cohort of arts managers of various kinds, right? Who are professionally doing that work. And in the absence of which, the craftspersons will still be at the mercy of middle persons who tend to be exploitative. And therefore, to remove the exploitative aspect of what is actually economically has become a weak sector, weak, quote unquote, with regard to our economy, you need to also shore it up with the right appropriate capacities. And this is also partly addressing a question that came from Jordi Pascual from UCLG in the question answers, that we need appropriate capacities. Thanks.
Professor Enrico, would you want to add to this, of if there is anything that we can learn from there, or your thoughts, whatever suits?
No, I wouldn't. I think that the situation is not. Yes, it's complex. I agree with also the point that have been said before. The role of also arts manager is important. The importance of educational institution for I mean, working on a mid and long-term perspective, because short-term solutions are not so easy. As Gurmeet was also citing some experience in UNESCO, I was quite impressed by a discussion that we had with some at UNESCO level, but applied to how to make, especially in African countries that have other problems in I mean, the issue of culture and development, it's relevant also there. But it was very interesting, the idea that trying to do policy intervention for triggering this economic development through culture many times is not very effective, because even in the policy setting, there are many factors that limit the longer term perspectives. And now at the international level, there is possibly the same investment that international organizations made can be done more in supporting the development of professionals, of skills that maybe don't have a short-term impact, but surely will create possibly, and in a more uncertain but possibly better way, longer-term effects. And this is, I think, a radical change in perspective if it is applied, of course, because we know that there can be many challenges on this. But I think this is really the right direction. Not try to think that short-term policy intervention can solve, because and we want to see the returns at the very short term, but possibly investing in long-term vision and investments in specific activities and strategies maybe can be can be more effective.
Point well taken. Of course, short-term things will have to be more like actions, but the vision has to be long-term, and the actions will then have to be aligned to what we really want to achieve, and whatever it may take, if it requires convergence of a lot of people together, or forgetting my boundaries to yield to a larger good, all of that, of course, is necessary. I think we have one more point from Laila ma'am, pertinent to how do you, I mean, there is a need, of course, for passing on the skills and the knowledge to the further generations, for it to be continuing. Otherwise, we would a lot of crafts, I'm sure all of us are aware, that we are those people that are there are the last ones of their sort. So considering that it is like an extinction, some of these can be really getting extinct. How do we, I mean, there are craft institutions, there are colleges in India, abroad, etc., which are, trying to deliver courses which are relating to crafts. But unfortunately, the polytechnic scenario, I mean, the way the higher education system works in the country is very, very oriented towards that regular form of engineering or some subjects like maybe architecture, etc., but nothing pertinent to crafts per se. So is there any thought from you wherein how we can strengthen that bit? Because we need to pass on this to the next generation for the continuance per se.
Well, I think that's an absolutely crucial area because, there's no point offering craftspeople marketing assistance unless you also help them in better design, better production, better, and basically also better knowledge of their own traditions. I think a point that all of us urban types who work with crafts often forget is that craftspeople cannot afford to keep samples. If you visit a craftsperson, he rarely has anything that has been made even 10 years ago because they sell them. They can't afford to keep it. They don't go to museums. They certainly can't afford to buy coffee table books on crafts and things. So we have to, and that is a whole area where I think the government is very well equipped to, with its outreach and its thing, to create a whole thing of documenting various crafts and preparing very simple, now it can be done even digitally, on, say, motives, on techniques, on the technology of craft, and in a way that is cheap and economic for craftspeople to access and use. I'm quite dismayed by the fact that many educational institutions, schools, colleges, and all that now have a kind of craft education program where someone is coming and teaching them how to do Madhubani painting and all that. But that, and those motives, then you find housewives who are preparing, doing this in an urban situation where people in Madhubani and Jitwarpur and all that don't actually know the kind of designs and motives and also the symbolic significance of their craft. The other aspect is that most of us always think of craft as two aspects. One is production and one is marketing. But there are many, many, many crafts that would greatly benefit from some technological upgradation as well. It is not necessary for every part of the craft process to be done by, a chap sitting on the ground with a little hammer chiseling away, or some woman making glass bangles in front of an open furnace. And there's certain parts of that process which can be mechanized, and where actually the ornamental part, the craft bit, the creative bit, can be then done. It frees the craftsperson to do that more effectively. So I think this whole aspect of education, documentation, awareness creation within the communities themselves is a very crucial aspect. It's not just enough to set up, craft institutions and things which are teaching urban Indians about craft, though that is important too, to create awareness and to perhaps encourage them to go to become designers or entrepreneurs. But I think the crafts communities themselves and local museums, community museums within the villages or the so-called cluster would be a wonderful thing where you have examples of the best crafts, the best designs, the best weaves and things, which would encourage. I myself have found that when you take craftspeople, you work with them on a design workshop and you say, you should do this or you should do that. And they say, oh, nobody's doing that now, or that's too difficult. But you take them to a museum or you take them to a collection and show them what their forefathers used to make. And it's like a light bulb going off in their heads. And they come back and they're inspired actually to do something of that level. So I think those things are absolutely crucial. And these are actually the areas where the government, with its huge outreach, with its financial resources, can do something without requiring to be, involved in the nitty-gritties or the sort of disbursement of funds, etc. I also really liked what Jagan said about, training people to be the skilled, not skilled so much, but knowledgeable intermediaries. Because one of the problems that we all have is that government officials don't stay in that same seat for very long. And you initiate a dialogue with somebody who's sensitive and knowledgeable, wants to do something. And by the time you've written your proposal, you find that they've departed, leaving only the towel on their chair. So, we need to have somebody there. In the early days, you had the Popul Jaikas, you had the Kamla Devis, the Prem Berries, and all who were part of that, and they understood it. But today, you can't expect every bureaucrat to be sensitive to the nuances of craft. And so there has to be somebody else there who understands that.
I think that point is very valid. In fact, that was one of the questions we missed putting in the list, because government will certainly have to take care of the hazard part of the occupation that we are talking. That there was somebody who was telling me that day that this town near, I think it was Sanganer or someplace, wherein the average life expectancy is only about 35 years, which
They all
is
have TB, they have, their Dhokra workers, again, sitting on open furnaces and things. We always talk of craft as eco-friendly, green practices, etc. It's far from it. And we should be investigating and doing something, investing in those areas of craft production which are hazardous.
totally. In fact, from Kanpur and all, where there's so much of leather industry, the kind of, there will be certain pollution standards which they will officially meet as part of that checklist. But I'm sure with the kind of living conditions and with the kind of the lower level craft people, the one who's really working on the ground, it's very critical for the government, because they will be the ones who can regulate that. Nobody else. For the want of earning that money, I wouldn't probably want to take care of my health and just keep doing that and that. And hearing that the life expectancy is only 35 years was alarming and scary. We can't compromise on that bit, of course. Also, I think what example Gurmeet ma'am gave, we have been fortunate to visit the initiatives that Aga Khan Foundation has done in Nizamuddin Basti in Delhi. The way they have sort of intervened with every angle of it, with the community, with the people, helping them, build schools, get into that. So it's a revival of a whole community, probably, rather than only the Nizamuddin Dargah or any. So it's form of an urban conservation context. But they've taken time and energy and money to do that, of course. They have been there on ground for last, I don't know if I'm not wrong, maybe 10 years or so. You need to handhold people to be able to first let them believe that you are part of them and you're not here to just do something what we did in Banaras or maybe like that. But
it's specifically to the needs of that community and that project. And
yes,
that is the big luxury that all of us need, from government, to be able to actually fit the community and the needs of the community and the potential of the community into what we are requesting.
yeah.
Ruchi,
So,
I think, Ruchi, if I may just suggest that when you make the white paper or the outcome document that you produce, also look into the need for appropriate roles to be played. It will be a good idea to actually begin to define what roles different actors have in building this, in achieving this agenda of championing local identity, right? The government can also sometimes get overbearing in terms of its role, and where it should be regulating, it actually becomes itself a manufacturer. The government should get out of the business of manufacturing crafts itself. that's not what the government should do. It should create the ecosystem so that the actual quote unquote authentic craftsperson and the crafts manufacturing can actually happen, right? So I think role allocation or role definition is really crucial. We cannot but rely on market forces, but market forces have shown themselves globally to be actually quite comfortable with authenticity, with, in fact, again, to look at the European context, a city like Bruges is has the maximum footfalls in the world in terms of tourism, and it's making hand over fist, I guess. It's making revenue from simply just preserving what it has, right? It didn't take much more than that. I mean, of course, it took a lot, but so I think having the right role definition will go a long way as well. So see if you can address that.
So I think I've been able to cover most of these questions, maybe directly or indirectly. But one thing which I know probably will not be able to cover up in this session is the last question to Professor Enrico, because you've been working in the cultural economy segment. Is there even a mechanism to put an economic value or to arrive at an economic value of the tangible intangible? Because unfortunately, all of us may still know and believe deep inside that these are things that are pertinent, despite we may not have, final numbers to prove to somebody. But because the benefits are in various ways, it's not a direct economic benefit that there is. So to be able to convince policymakers, to be able to convince government, we probably need something to convince them. Those numbers, I think somebody took a very nice word during the conversation. So do you think there is anything like that? Do we even try looking at it, or just go by, by the push of it?
I think, yes, there is. And many times economists and economists dealing on cultural and creative economy have been are approached actually to find way to a metrics to first of all to understand areas like crafts, heritage that are difficult to be measured. And secondly, also because these sectors, compared to others, need some economic legitimization somehow. So, I mean, this is actually the job that I would say that in the 50% of our work is in this direction. Let me very briefly, let me try to give you some views. I would say in order to try to measure the economic value of heritage, the fundamental distinction is between tangible and let's say intangible. And because in the intangible parts, I would say is easier to measure somehow. Just to give you an example, if we look at the craft sector, that the craft sector belongs to intangible heritage practices, nowadays there are a lot of studies that try to measure the economic contribution of craft sector being considered as a manufacturing sector somehow, but there are somehow standard statistics that can be used. Now here the problem is these measures only capture most of the time the formal sector. With some adjustments, one can take into account also the informal sector somehow in terms of economic statistics only for the contribution. Here the point is that these metrics have been developed most of the time at the national or regional level, and I haven't seen. I have also tried to look at the Indian context for statistics. I mean, there are statistics on the craft sectors, for example, or the performing arts at the national level, at the regional level. In terms of export, there are the UNESCO UNCTAD report. There are many statistics on this. What I haven't seen, and this can be an interesting challenge, is better understanding the city economies of crafts and their contribution to the local economy. And this can be done many times also through not only quantitative approaches, but also qualitative, better understanding the social forces behind. For the tangible heritage, and this is the other part, I mean, it's a bit more complicated to have a unique approach, a single approach for measuring the economic contribution. Tangible, if we look at the tangible heritage sectors like museums or monuments, most of the time it is a very tiny economic sector, but the potential value that it can generate in terms of tourism attractiveness, other activities connected, for example, to the conservation, this can be quite large. In this case, let's say studies that approach on a macro level, like the one, for example, for measuring the size of the craft sector, are not very applicable. And in this case, you need to rely more on specific methodologies that focus on for example, trying to understand the non-market value of the heritage sites, and in this case, are more tailored to the very specific need that you have. But yes, surely the development of these statistics, of these metrics, is fundamental to foster the debate of the economic contribution, of the social also contribution of the culture and heritage in the society.
Got that point. In fact, what you said is extremely right in case of New York and all, when we saw the landmark buildings that were there. They were one of the richest landholders, because every time the FAR or the buildable ratio on the zone increased, because they were not supposed to build anymore, they were the ones who kept accumulating that bit and probably selling it to others off nearby sites and plots, and earning money in return. So they in fact became the landmark sites, etc., in the middle of the business district of Manhattan. Probably is the richest site or the richest landholder that way. So of course, yes, that attributes to the economic value of the build. And
yes. Also, let me just add, as you say, the impact, for example, on real estate properties is something that can be also measured. For example, in Italy, we have just ended up a study at the municipal level, using all the data at the municipal level, try to measure the economic impact of getting a World Heritage designation on real estate properties. And what we found is a 3% increase, but steadily in the next 5 years after the designation, on real estate markets for the municipalities that obtained these the UNESCO World Heritage designation. This is just another additional example.
Yeah. So, Jagan sir, one last bit. You're also raising your hand. You can first say what you already have in mind.
No, go ahead. Please ask the question.
Just one small thing. I think, as I agree with the long-term benefit, but as quick tools, because the cities keep producing master plans. I mean, we being urban planners understand that that is one tool which is very, very statutory in nature, something which has to be implemented times. And this time in the Delhi master plan also, while the team was doing it, we tried to bring in this flavor of heritage and culture more than only, you know, some zones that were defined by the earlier plan. So do you think that bringing in this component of cultural economics and supporting cultural actions or activities spatially through the tool of the master plan makes sense? I mean,
certainly you cited the example of the entire complex in Nizamuddin, for instance. Without the spatial definition of that zone as being subject to conservation action, that wonderful space would not have developed. And when I say the wonderful space, it's all of those sites which are clustered around and and need work. And I think that's also brings up the point about the time, right? I mean, things do take time. So you can't be in the business of championing a local identity and expect that the identity is something which is time bound. It isn't. It's a living heritage, right? So so I think we might benefit in the Indian context from beginning to apply the terms we use for more mainstream economic modeling, say for instance, life cycle costs or life cycle value, right? Because that certainly pertains very much to the crafts. In a sense, their life cycle is cannot be estimated, but their economic value to society, if seen in that way, can help us to recognize what heritage basically is, whether it's tangible or intangible. So we've got to find new ways of, if necessary, changing the nomenclature as well. What's in a name? It doesn't matter what you call it, as long as within the overall sort of regime of regulation, planning, financing, it finds its appropriate spot, so that it fits within your worldview as a government, right? So I think master plans, of course, must recognize the areas which are tangible heritage, but we shouldn't forget that intangible heritage requires space, right? And that's where we go wrong, right? We've forgotten that intangible heritage requires space as well. So Gurmeet has been working on reviving the capacity to work with lime, because lime mortar, frankly, has helped us retain thousands and thousands of year-old structures, whereas new cement buildings fall down in 20 years. So, but where's the space for the lime craft, right? Which lime industry, actually, within our larger urban regions. Are we allocating space for that? That doesn't show value in itself, but it's a necessary condition to achieve the value that you want out of your heritage buildings, right? So there's there's a lot here to unpack, obviously, and I hope you will unpack it in your white paper. But yeah, I guess I'll pause there. Thanks.
Too many thoughts to put together. Yes.
So, Ruchi, one comment I wanted to make here was that the whole theme of this particular webinar is about local identity. So the answers clearly is in the question itself, that the answers will come from local. While we clearly know that national government, the whole federal system is where all the resources are, and there is this, from top to down, from national to regional to local, that line of dialogue or line of work exists in our models of development. But clearly, if we really want to champion local identity, we need to find solutions. The questions can come from national and regional. The answers will come from local. And I think we just have to be, and it's not as complex as, because, I mean, like Laila's been in it for 50 years. I've been into this sector for 30 years. We have the questions, we have the answers as well. And there are enough case studies, and there are very interesting models that NIUA itself is putting into place. For instance, the cities program. I mean, in my so many years of practice planning, this particular program of cities program, where you're actually systematically working between baseline data, user-centric design, you're talking about feasibility studies, you're getting into monitoring and evaluation thing, you've got stakeholder mapping, you've got a stakeholder engagement plan, you've got a communication and outreach plan, where the learning really is that the capacities at the local government, the capacities at which governance, these things have to roll out. That's where the challenge is. And like what Jagan is saying, that you clearly need to know who are these people, who are the stakeholders, and what is the role of each of the stakeholders, so that you're not stepping into each other's toes. And I think the problem really happens is that you kind of go through a process and finally the decision gets made by one or two, kind of set groups of people or individuals or people on a chair. So I think that's where the challenge is. And how do you protect the whole system analysis from getting, hijacked knowingly or unknowingly, is where I think we need the checks and balances, that all egos are adequately massaged, but you get the output the way you want it,
Ruchi, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in again because Gurmeet mentioned the cities program, but also another scheme that Gurmeet was very involved in was the Hriday program. And I can't for the life of me figure out why the government decided to not take it forward beyond its pilot phase. 500 crores, that's it. It produced so much experience about that local identity, right, Gurmeet? I mean, I hope you agree. There were good things and bad, but we should have invested more in a program like Hriday, and yet we haven't. So I think the cities program with its environmental, social, and governance framework, as well as the Hriday scheme, we've already done a lot. Plus, don't forget, many of the smart cities have focused on heritage areas as their local identity. Okay, so there's a lot already at play. So I hope NIUA will consolidate the learnings for the purpose of looking at local identity. Thanks.
I think, sir, listening to all of you, willingness is that keyword which still isn't finding too much space in the whole agenda from the top down, because Hriday scheme, like you mentioned, was there. It was floated. There was 12 cities roped in with a lot of intention of bringing a sort of local knowledge, because I remember being part of that, and it was clearly asking for people who had expertise of working in that region, or at least in that city. So the intention was that you don't bring in outside forces, you bring in somebody who understands the region, who knows the city, who knows the challenges already, and it's already equipped with that. And it happened so. I mean, people automatically got aligned. People who were working in Rajasthan, who were working in Punjab, etc., automatically got aligned, and they took forward those. But yes, like
nevertheless, we forgot the Hriday scheme.
So for Enrico,
and sorry, Ruchi, one thing I'd like to say, one culprit, though for the longest I've worked in the tourism sector, 1 billion of the piece is tourism here. With all those nice things that the spin-offs of tourism is, to say that cultural heritage.
I hope Enrico will challenge that.
Because the learning of Hriday was finally understood that it kind of looks similar as the Prasad scheme of Ministry of Tourism. Now, the point is, as a cultural heritage practitioner for 30 years, I've worked with Ministry of Cultures and Departments of Culture, with tourism departments, and then subsequently with urban development. And I think the answer lies with the urban development department. Basically, it lies with the Department of Local Government, whether it's a rural level or urban level, because they are the ones who manage, it's their jurisdiction. You're looking at city as a whole. You're not looking at a sector or spin-off. So I think the moment you start dancing to the music of the imaginary tourist, we really mess it up. And so I do believe that Hriday got pushed aside because of the general understanding that it's similar to tourism schemes. And I think that's where the course correction is required.
So for Enrico, I would just mention that Hriday scheme was a scheme which was floated by the Ministry of Urban Development, Ministry of Housing in India, and the focus was on rejuvenation of heritage cities. So that was the scheme. Hriday is a word that comes from the what should I say, of the Hindi dictionary. And
Sanskrit, it's Sanskrit for heart, for soul.
Yes, it's a synonym for heart. So that the idea was there, the intention was there, but somehow, unfortunately, down the line, it didn't. And I think what Gurmeet ma'am was saying is true. It would have taken that approach, that it's probably the job of the Ministry of Tourism or Ministry of Culture to take care. Why do we put our our resources and our time and energy into it?
So Ruchi, you have to recognize it as an urban asset. Sorry, Enrico. Please proceed.
No, I agree, and I think it goes on the same direction on what I was saying, or we were discussing at the beginning. I mean, interagencies cooperation and having them aligned is necessary, but also very challenging, because many times the problems arise when different agencies or departments are not cooperating, or even are pursuing different or conflicting conflicting objectives. Just to give you, well, since we are talking about tourism, also tourism in Europe in many cities is becoming a problem. Also a problem related to master plan. Just to give you an idea, here the historic city centers in Italy, most of them now, there is a very huge debate about the short-term rental apartments that are substituting basically, or not only substituting. On one hand, they are making the owners of the apartments of the historic centers to have an incentive to rent for tourists using, well, these well-known platforms and they are at the same time threatening the hotel and accommodation sectors, but at the same time they are making the historic city centers empty of the local residents. And for example, in Italy, but in Europe it is becoming an issue. Cities have to regulate these, have the power to regulate short-term rents of apartments, and they have been somehow, especially in the Italian context, not very reactive in understanding the effects at the urban level that this new market was creating. At the same time, for example, in rural areas, these short-term rental solutions are seen as an opportunity nowadays, because since there is a lack of accommodation facilities in a hotel, now you can more easily reach this area and maybe having some tourist flows that in the past were very difficult to be obtained. So, I mean, the situation is complex, but of course, the master planning or having a focus on the urban dynamics or the territorial dynamics is really important also for tourism.
Very well placed. I think, yeah, also we have overshot our time by almost 40 minutes. So I have two requests to make, although I wanted to summarize, but I think we are already there. Let me not repeat things and do the same thing again. I will request Tarini. I think she's requested everybody to stay back for a picture. We take one. Also, we have, I don't know, Tarini, is Jordi still around?
Ma'am, I'll just check. Give me 1 minute. Yes, he is.
So Jordi, I'm hoping that the question may not be directly answered, but Jagan Sir tried to do that. But the rest of the panelists, the thoughts that they have poured in, I thought it sort of answers your question. So I'm not putting up the question directly to the panel again. All right. So yeah, with this, let us close it. I knew this is going to happen, and therefore that heads up earlier that please keep that buffer there. I think we should do that picture thing. Tani, will you also be putting on your camera? Raman, you can do that. And let's do this and close it.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Raman. Good to see you.
I'll just take it.
Thank you so much, all of you, for Abhi. Tarni, have you done it?
No, I'm on my way. Requesting everybody to smile.
But we can't see you. Your camera seems to be off.
Yeah, I have switched on my camera. 1 second, I'll just switch it on. Yeah.
Yes.
You have to smile too.
Yes, sir. Okay, I'm just clicking. Thank you.
Thank you
So much. And thank you so much for all your thoughts. I will again request you to just click pictures of whatever paper you have in hand and share it right away. Because I really don't want all of you to sit down and type. Let that be the local identity for all of us. So just share that. I'm sure there must be some scribbles, some circles, some things written there. If not, that's also fine, no problem. So if you can share these things with us, I'm sure my team, I have 4 or 5 other members who you can't see here, who are rigorously putting down thoughts. And I'm receiving feedback on my phone saying that it went off as a very, very engaging and interesting session. Thank you so much from
Thank
all
you,
of
Ruchi.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
to the
you.
panelists. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you, Tarini.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Chalo, so it went off well, I guess. I'm
Yes,
hoping
ma'am.
to hear more from Apoor and people who are recording. Let's see. Vignesh, you can stop the recording, please. I think he's the one who's recording, if I'm not wrong.
Shafiq sir has the recording. Matlab pura webinar has been recording. We'll get the recording by Monday.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Bye.